Hello, gathered friends, I'm Horror Nuva, and welcome to Bionicle Deep Dive, where we analyze the tropes, characters, and lore of LEGO Bionicle. In this video, I wanted to examine some theories as to why Makuta Teridax didn't intervene in the Toa-Dark Hunter War in Metru Nui, including that he may have been behind it in the first place. All of these theories are purely my speculative hypotheses on what might have happened. The subject of why he didn't intervene was never even brought up in canon. However, I think that if we look at what we know of Teridax's character and goals, we can actually come up with some pretty interesting ideas as to why he might choose to let it happen. Let's dive right into it. So, just to get out of the way, the Doyleist or out-of-universe explanation for why Makuta didn't intervene is that his involvement just wouldn't work for the story Greg Farsty was trying to tell in the side stories written about the war, which are Birth of a Dark Hunter and Legacy of Evil. The war essentially worked as the vehicle to explain Nidiki's backstory, betrayal, and origins as a Dark Hunter, and that story wouldn't have worked as well if Makuta were involved. His presence would have completely changed the course of the war, as he and the Brotherhood forces would likely have been so powerful the Toa wouldn't have been so desperate that Nidiki would have betrayed them. And more importantly, his presence in the narrative would steal the spotlight from who the story was actually meant to be about. The story was meant to show how the Toa of Likon's generation faced the Dark Hunters, and their character and struggles during that. In addition, the concept that the Makuta were assigned to specific regions to oversee, and that Teridax was the Makuta of Metru Nui, might not have even been fully conceived in the story ideas when they were written. We don't know. So that's why, from a writing perspective, Greg didn't make Makuta a part of this story. But let's take a look in-universe and speculate if there might have been reasons for that based on the lore. Because if you think about it, this is kind of the exact scenario in which he should get involved. The Dark Hunters set out to conquer the city and in the process working the city ground to a halt. If this continued for too long, it would likely affect the Great Spirit's health. Part of the very reason the Brotherhood of Makuta even began watching over regions of the universe was because of the Matoran civil war in Metru Nui tens of thousands of years earlier. That war also caused work to halt in the city, only to be resolved at the intervention of Makuta Teridax. And not long before that, during the era of the League of Six Kingdoms, Teridax himself led an army of Toa to stop the Baraki from conquering the city. All that to say, there was huge precedent for him to get involved, as the situation was exactly like the other scenarios in which he did. Now, one theory is, he did intervene, indirectly, by sending an army of Toa to aid the city like he did against the League. Initially, the Dark Hunters completely overwhelmed the Toa Mangai, but then a break came when a Toa of Water, later given the name Naho, managed to slip through the Dark Hunter lines and swim the entire Silver Sea until she came to another island and begged for help from Metru Nui. The result was around 100 Toa arriving in the city and turning it into an all-out war. Now, I don't think that he intervened with the first wave of Toa that came, mostly because I feel like that's just not what the story is trying to communicate. I mean, yes, maybe the Turaga that Naho came to contacted the Brotherhood and they organized the Toa, but honestly, it feels like it was more the Turaga who organized the Toa of several surrounding islands to come to their aid. Just from a writing perspective, I actually really like the idea that the initial Toa army was organized by Turaga and Toa from across the Matoran community to come help. However, there's another point I think Makuta could have gotten involved. The war ended when an additional 300 Toa came to the island and ambushed the Dark Hunters. These Toa secretly arrived in supply ships overnight. Now, I think it's very possible that the Makuta sent these. By this point, the war had gone on for 6 months, and the Brotherhood certainly would have noticed. I think it makes more sense for this wave of Toa to be sent by the Brotherhood. We never hear about how these reinforcements were organized, so it doesn't contradict anything, and it would make sense that the Brotherhood would have a higher capacity to organize Toa on a large scale. Another theory is that Makuta Teridax didn't intervene, or perhaps even caused the war, because it actually benefited him. I highly doubt Teridax would have wanted the Dark Hunters to win the war. First, it would have been so much harder for him to wrest control if they were in charge. There's just no way he'd be able to trick Lariska, for example, into a mind-wiping pod, and trying to take back the city by force once the Dark Hunters were established would have been costly. Second, while the Shadowed One didn't want the city destroyed just to have control of its resources, The violent and destructive hunters might have caused damage, or worse, killed some of the Matoran who Teridax needed if he was ever to take over. Makuta knew that the Matoran of the city were the true key, but the Shadowed One didn't, and might have executed some to make an example. Makuta's whole plan during Legends of Metru Nui required the city to function as an intense police state, in which Dume, whom Makuta was disguised as, had complete trust and authority over the population. A manufactured crisis like this would likely lead to an increased Vaki presence, as well as an increased trust in Turaga Dume for leading them through this crisis. At the time of the Great Cataclysm, the Matoran had so much trust in Turaga Dume they followed his orders without hesitation or question, even though he had been acting strange for months at this point. It was said that this trust came from centuries of him leading them through crises before, so it's likely that the Dark Hunter War led them to trust him fully. And when looking at the state of Metru Nui before the Dark Hunters tried to take it, it makes sense that Teridax would need to make some kind of crisis to get them afraid before he tried his own takeover. According to the timeline, Metru Nui began a golden age of peace and prosperity after the end of the Matoran Civil War. By the time the Dark Hunters released the Kanoi Dragon, this golden age had lasted for 75,000 years, the vast majority of their history. During that time, Metru Nui had no Toa, with the last known instance of Toa being in the Metru Nui area being the original imprisonment of the Kanoi Dragon, sometime more than 80,000 years ago. There were no threats to the city. The mere idea that someone would attack them was considered crazy, given how much the rest of the universe relied on Metru Nui. It was possible that some of the Matoran weren't even around the last time Metru Nui was in peril, and if they were, it was a distant memory. If the Matoran were so used to peace and had no crisis in their minds, they might not have been so willing to follow the false Duma's word when he declared a crisis that required them to give up their freedoms. They might question or doubt his claims that they would need to get in the pods, and if they resisted, it might get very messy. Teridax would need some series of events that would get the Matoran of Metru Nui in a much more fearful mindset, where they would hand over their freedoms to someone who they believed they could trust. Now, one might say, why wouldn't Makuta personally end the war in a public way in order to gain the trust and goodwill of the Matoran for himself? While ending the conflict might give the Makuta a better reputation, there really was no point in getting the Matoran to like the Makuta before the Great Cataclysm, since he was going to wipe their minds anyways. It would be more beneficial to use the existing trust they had in their Turaga to manipulate them. Especially given that the Brotherhood was already regarded with fear, given how Teridax ended the Matoran Civil War in a massacre. There was likely no way he could have easily gotten them to trust them enough to hand over their freedoms to him. But he could have gotten them to trust Dume that much, if Dume had led them through a crisis in relatively recent memory. Which the Dark Hunter War was, considering that it was only 2,000 years before the Great Cataclysm. But how could he have caused the war? I think he could have used his psychic powers to influence the Shadowed One into trying to take Metru Nui. It was said that in the lead up to the invasion, the Shadowed One had become obsessed with Metru Nui after trying for nearly 1,000 years to gain a political foothold on the island. Maybe it's possible that his obsession was actually subtle psychic influence from Makuta. We've seen Makuta do this kind of thing already, using his telepathic abilities to plant ideas in others' minds that they then pursue relentlessly. This is the entire reason that the Paraka became obsessed with finding the Mask of Life. He planted the idea in their head and continually pushed them to keep after it. Makuta also planted the names of the Toa Metru in Toa Likan's head, changing his mind from his original picks. So, this is definitely Makuta's MO. It's possible that he gave the Shadowed One the first idea to use the Kanoi Dragon as leverage to gain influence in the city, and continued to psychically egg him on for centuries until he declared war. So after thinking about all these ideas, my personal headcanon is that Makuta Teridax engineered the war by psychically influencing the Shadowed One to pursue Metru Nui. A conflict of this nature would likely lead to an increased security and police presence in Metru Nui, as well as boost the level of public trust in their leader to absolute levels, both of which was necessary for his own plans to work. He allowed the war to go on for months in order to raise the conflict, and when it had gone on long enough, he had the Brotherhood organize an additional army of 300 Toa to swiftly end the war before any permanent damage was done to the city or to the Great Spirit. Now, of course, Makuta's already a bit of an absurd, secretly behind it all type villain, and I can see where some might find it overkill to have even more things be all his fault. But when we really consider his goals and methods, as well as the fact that by rights he should have intervened in this, all of these things fit well, as they would push Metru Nui in the direction it would need to be for his eventual takeover. It also makes Makuta that much more like Emperor Palpatine from Star Wars, and the two of them already have an insane amount of parallels, since they are both amazing examples of basically the same type of villain. But those are my ideas on what Makuta was actually doing during the Toa-Dark Hunter War. Do you like this theory? Or do you think other ideas work to explain his actions and motivations during this time? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you guys soon. Take care, my gathered friends.